Hello, and thanks for listening to the Farming Today podcast with me, Kaz Graham. In this edition, artificial insemination of bees. Yes, you heard, bees. And costly border checks and paperwork for British food exporters will last until 2027.
I'm just disappointed at the length of time it's taking. Exports are down. Agri-food exports from the UK are 20% down since Brexit. There's weed growing in the yard.
We'll have more on that shortly. First, though, we regularly discuss genetics and breeding in livestock here on Farming Today, but I don't think we've ever reported on bee breeding. Well, we are today. There are various ways of breeding bees, including open mating and artificial or instrumental insemination. As part of our week-long look at pollinators, we've been to visit Bishop's Bees in Devon, where owner Darren Molyneux is developing genetic lines suited to the UK climate. He showed our reporter Fiona Clampin how bee insemination is done. Where's that coming from?
That's the queen, yes. And if you've got a whole lot of queens together, it can be quite loud.
So you brought the queen over in a little blue box.
She's been in the box for about 7 days to reach sexual maturity. So she's the right age to inseminate. And by keeping her with lots of other bees, there's about 150 bees in there. They look after the queen. They keep her healthy, they groom her, they'll feed her, and they'll make sure she's healthy prior to insemination. And then she'll be reintroduced to them again post-insemination, so that they can look after her again there, and they'll massage her abdomen to help mobilise semen up the spermofecal duct and into spermatheca. We've made a lot of mistakes with bees in the past. We've bred them for things that don't always benefit the colony.
What sort of things do you mean that we've bred out?
We have bred out a lot of defensive behaviours. You do get some colonies that just do not mobilise a defence. And then we've got things like propolis production, which is a resin that the bees produce. They collect resins from trees, and it's used as an antibacterial envelope around the colony, but it also sticks the hive together, and for a beekeeper it's frustrating. The result is, though, that you lessen that antibacterial envelope surrounding the colony, which means that you're taking away part of their immune system. By using insemination, you can bring some of these things back in. Having that control of breeding, it means that we have a little bit more control and can counteract things that we've done wrong in the past. Put them in the bag and then fill it with CO2. And we just let it fill up. But all the CO2 fills the bottom of the bag quite nicely, so the bees will be covered in it. Bees don't have lungs like we do. They don't suffocate. They just can't mobilise. And then we'll just top up the bag with CO2 just to make sure she stays asleep as needed. None of them moving at all.
Do you think it stresses them at all?
No. It's basically like being put under anaesthetic, but without the struggle. Right, so we're going to feed the queen into a tube with a dead end. It's called a backup tube because if she walks to the end and realises dead end, her natural response is to walk backwards, which means that we can then get her into the queen holder. So we just gently feed her in. She's still quite sleepy from the CO2. And then we want to make sure she's nice and straight in the unit. And then we'll just bring the insemination tip down, and we bring the semen just to the end of the tip.
This is like a kind of syringe almost.
The aperture at the end of the tip is 0.16 millimetres in diameter. If she's properly aligned, it's a straight track all the way down to her ovaries. Just inject the semen and pull it back out.
So there you go. How to artificially inseminate a bee. That was Darren Molyneux of Bishop's Bees in Devon. Now, changes to the costs, paperwork and bureaucracy that are hampering agri-food exports from Great Britain to the European Union won't be in place until 2027. If you remember back to May after the UK-EU summit, many farmers and food producers were cheered by the news that a common SPS, that's sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, was on the cards, meaning that the vast majority of movements of animals, animal products, plants and plant products between Great Britain and the EU could be undertaken without certificates or controls. DEFRA figures show that companies spent more than £36 million on export licences for food and farming products to the EU last year, and that doesn't factor in the labour costs and added admin. These costs weren't incurred when the UK was part of the Union. Nick Thomas Symonds is the Minister for EU Relations, and he's been setting out his priorities for the future of the UK-EU relationship in a speech in front of industry representatives and journalists. And he outlined why a reset on regulations and costs for food and farming businesses is one of them.
Let's say you're in the agri-food business, selling your goods to Europe. You will need an export health certificate to transport food across the border. £200. Not a one-off fee, not a fee per lorry, but a fee per consignment. If you are exporting salmon or beef, queuing times for SPS checks, £149 for each shipment. If you're selected for sampling, up to £1,400 per shipment on fees, waiting times and the cost of the product sampled. Companies big and small are crying out for change, for practical help, to bring down bills so they can make goods cheaper for the public.
Nick Thomas Symonds. Negotiators are also seeking agreements on energy, fishing, defence and working towards a youth experience scheme. David Henig is director of the UK Trade Policy Project at the think tank, the European Centre for International Political Economy, as well as an expert advisor to the UK Trade and Business Commission. He was at the event where Nick Thomas Symonds was speaking, and I asked him what was new in what he had to say.
I think there were two things that were new from Nick Thomas Symonds. One, that he is targeting a agreement date for negotiations on a food and drink deal with the EU in 2027. We didn't have a date before, and there had been some hints that the government thought it could be done a lot quicker than that. The second thing we heard is that whilst he may look for exemptions from EU regulations for the UK, he is not going to state in advance any of them to be red lines. So therefore, on areas like, for example, gene editing, we don't know if the UK will get any exemptions from alignment with EU rules. And that is also, I think, pretty important.
OK, let's start with those timescales. 2027 seems a long way away. But is that actually a realistic timescale for these kinds of negotiations?
Yes, it is realistic. The most recent negotiations between Switzerland and the EU took about 18 months from this point to conclusion. It should be said, this is just the completion of negotiations. The target for that, implementation would follow and may take some time. He also didn't commit to when in 2027, so that could be January, that could be December.
Well, the deal struck in May is based on dynamic alignment with the EU. Just briefly explain what that is, why it might take time and why it's so controversial. We talk about these red lines here, and that's, Kemi Badenoch said that she would just reverse it and that would be that.
Dynamic alignment means that the UK will follow EU rules on food and drink, in return for which our product will enter the EU without any checks. Why is it controversial? Because it means the UK following rules set by the EU in which we don't have a final say. We may have some kind of say along the way, but we won't have any vote on it when it comes to these being implemented. And it may go beyond the rules for crops or keeping animals. It may go on to things like environmental rules. We don't actually know the exact scope of this. So that's also why it's controversial. But unless you align your regulations in some way, you are not going to get full free access to the EU market. Nick Thomas Symonds did return to that several times over to say that's the choice, and we have chosen that we are going to go with EU rules.
Well, the minister was talking about carve-outs, meaning kind of exceptions to this alignment. And he was asked a question about whether these would be gene-edited crops, which currently the UK allows, but the EU is still treating the same as GM rather than gene-edited, although they are moving towards accepting them. And the ban on live animal exports and also imports of foie gras, which Labour has pledged to ban. But Nick Thomas Symonds wasn't giving anything away, was he?
He didn't really give anything away on the exceptions. Within the common understanding document that was agreed between the UK and the EU, in May. The UK had already got a carve out for higher levels of animal welfare than the EU, which probably includes live animal exports. So most likely we are going to be able to keep those. On gene editing, I think it will be more a case of the EU's rules are evolving in the direction of the UK, so it will probably be some kind of process towards aligning the two, which will incorporate some of what the UK has passed, but perhaps not all of it. On the import ban on foie gras, I suspect that's not going to be taken forward. This has been a long-term goal for many campaigners, but it's something the government has not done, and I suspect it will be difficult in these talks. There will also be other issues that come up of how we get particular regional conditions recognised for the UK, so there will have to be a lot of detail to work through, and the Minister was making it clear he wanted to hear from organisations representing various sectors of agriculture to make sure he knew all of these issues before going into talks.
Yeah, and what would you say the mood in the room was like? Because there were journalists, but there were also people from industry, weren't there?
There were various thoughts within industry, some who frankly thought that this should happen immediately and were really rather impatient that it wasn't going to, others welcoming the direction of travel. In general, there weren't opponents in the room, but not everybody was treating this as unequivocally good news because this was going to take some time to go into implementation.
That's David Henig from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Charles Bourne also attended the minister's speech, and he was one of those that weren't entirely impressed by what he'd had to say. He's a director of Taste of the West, which blows a trumpet for food producers across southwest England, and he's managing director of Westaway's Sausages in Newton Abbot, who export to the EU.
He was very credible, and he did articulate very well some of the issues around lorry drivers being held at checkpoints and people like myself filling in paperwork. But the big disappointment to me was the fact that I think it's the 19th of May, with much fanfare, there was the announcement that we were going to remove SPS checks. And to hear that this is being kicked further down the line until 2027, it just seems that the government might be fighting on too wide a front at this moment. Actually, if SPS checks are the real problem that will remove a lot of the friction in UK trade, then why don't we address some of that? Because the longer it goes on, the resolve of those exporting, and frankly, my very loyal customers in Europe, is being tested.
I know you managed to grab a few words with the minister after his speech. What did you ask him?
I was really just saying, when are we going to see some tangible support for SMEs in our sector? And unfortunately, I got a pretty flat bat response, 2027, and I'm not saying when in 2027.
I mean, I know that the minister has said on the issue of the timescale that the EU has its own processes and structures that need to be in place, and that here a bill would need to go through Parliament, and then there are logistics such as computer systems to be up and running, and that 18 months seems reasonable and realistic. What would you say to that?
I'm saying that break it down into smaller bite-sized chunks and don't try to negotiate on too wide a front, because otherwise it's too difficult. And I think that their response would be, oh, well, we have to do the whole deal. It's one deal or no deal. So I'm just disappointed that the length of time it's taking. Exports are down. Agri-food exports from the UK are 20% down since Brexit. There's weed growing in the yard, and it will make it even more difficult to restart business and to restart relationships. We really need action now to get some benefit, some tangible benefit back to the very important, small and medium-sized enterprises that work in food and drink.
That's Charles Bourne from Taste of the West. And that is all from us for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Beatrice Fenton. And Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.